right, well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm delighted to give a talk at Banco Central de Chile, but sometime I want to visit there because I grew up in Panama and never made it to South America. So for the future, is my screen shared properly? Yes, good. All right, so this paper was written for a project that's going on at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, led by Jim Paterba and Ed Glazer. And this was written for a conference and a volume on the economics of infrastructure investment. And Jim Paterba and them had some good foresight about how this become an even more important topic. And there were a number of people talking about transportation and micro sorts of things. And I was tasked with talking about the macroeconomic consequences. So there's renewed interest in infrastructure spending, and particularly since 2008. First of all, in 2008, during the global financial crisis, when many governments were considering short-run stimulus, many people thought that infrastructure spending would be a good idea, and were looking for what they called shovel-ready projects in order to get the spending out quickly. But even beyond that, there's been an enduring interest in the potential importance of infrastructure for productivity. Some of that goes back to the important work by David Ashour, but also more recently, DeLong and Summers were arguing that if government spending can raise potential output, it could actually pay for itself by generating higher future output for a sustained amount of time, and could therefore raise tax revenues. And currently in the US, there's bipartisan support for a big infrastructure package, although with all the political wheeling and dealing, they still haven't passed it. So then the question I ask in this paper is, what are the short-run and long-run effects of government investment in general and infrastructure investment in particular? So what do I do in this paper? It's sort of somebody told me when I was first giving it, this is another mini handbook chapter. It first analyzes the effects of government investment in DSGE models. I first use a simple neoclassical model, but then I go on to use a medium-scale New Keynesian model. Now, the neoclassical model is important because, first of all, the New Keynesian models are actually built on the foundation of a neoclassical model. And so many of the neoclassical mechanisms will show up in a New Keynesian model unless they're specifically shut down. Also, if we're thinking about long-run effects of infrastructure spending, the neoclassical model is the one that is most appropriate for thinking about the long run. I discuss multipliers, including the importance of the starting level of public capital. Then I use insights from these theoretical models to interpret some of the empirical work, estimating the aggregate effects of government investment spending. I review and extend some of the estimates of the short-run effects of government investment spending, with particular attention to highway spending. And I consider whether the US is underinvesting in infrastructure. I'm able to use the simple neoclassical model to come up with a framework to think about this. So, it can be used for a number of other countries. All right. So any questions, a little pit stop after the brief introduction before I start getting into the details. Okay, so for the quantitative analysis, I'll start with a stylized neoclassical model, then move on to a medium-scale New Keynesian model. A big message from this paper is the importance of time to spend and time to build. And I'll talk in detail about that. I'll talk about long-run multipliers, the importance of the initial level of public capital, and then some generalizations that would significantly affect the results that I show you. All right, so let's start with the benchmark neoclassical model. We start with the resource constraint that says that consumption plus private investment plus government consumption spending, so G supersedes government consumption spending, plus government investment have to be less than or equal to total output in the economy. The utility function is for the most part pretty standard. It's what's known as a McCurdy utility function, log of consumption minus a term that gives you the disutility of labor. So this is hours worked or employment, okay? I'm going to assume that any utility from government consumption is separable in the utility function. That's just to simplify so we don't get a lot of other interesting but out of the range of focus of what I want to focus on, effects of government consumption spending. In particular, we don't want it to affect the marginal rate of substitution. Okay? So we're not saying that government consumption spending is wasteful. We're simply saying it has a separate term in the utility function. The production function, the first part is completely standard. We have TFP, we have output, constant returns to scale in my basic production function I'm going to look at. In private inputs, so capital and labor, and this is capital at the end of period T-1. I'm using linear timing here so that it goes with the programs that I've posted that everybody can use. What's new here is, of course, the government capital. K super G is government capital, and the extent to which that increases output is governed by this theta G, and that's a parameter you're going to hear throughout this talk. Now notice that because I've assumed constant returns to scale in private inputs, we're getting potentially increasing returns to scale here if theta G is greater than 0 because of the government capital. Government capital accumulates by government investment in capital. It also depreciates with the delta G. Private capital accumulates through the usual equation of, private investment plus 1 minus delta, whatever capital you had before. For simplicity, again, I'm not going to have distortionary taxation, even though that's very realistic. I'm only going to think about lump sum tax financing because the effects can differ so much if you have distortionary taxation in terms of the timing of the taxation and those sorts of things. So I'm just going to have this lump sum taxation and looking at government spending, government investment, and government capital. Okay, so a few comments. Because I have no distortionary taxation, this is equivalent to a social planner problem. The separability of government consumption simplifies the problem, as I said. Now, I'm also, for many of my experiments, I'm just going to look at an exogenous shock to government investment. But I will also discuss a more general model where the social planner actually chooses the level of government investment and government capital. And that's when we'll start thinking about what the optimal levels are. Okay. Now, there's an alternative production function that I don't use, although I've run some experiments with it, that was suggested. It's actually a special case of the Glom and Ravi Kumar type of production functions. And when I presented this at Stanford, Chad Jones and Pete Kleinow just didn't like that increasing returns thing. And they said, why don't you do something like this? And when I saw what they were talking about, I said, oh, that's a special case of Glom and Ravi Kumar. And it's an interesting idea because in this production function, there's congestion, which the government capital helps relieve. And for this case, we have the same first part of the production function that I had before. The same, the numerator is the same as what I had before, government capital to the theta G. But now there is this private input part that's in the denominator. What that does is mean that individual firms think of themselves as facing constant returns to scale, but there's an externality, a negative externality of this congestion that they don't take into account. So the private firms act like they're just constant returns to scale, but there's that congestion, but then the government can relieve that congestion so that you can have overall constant returns to scale. And this is an interesting alternative that I don't use here. I found that the results were quite similar for the particular parameterizations I have. Okay. Just a quick summary of the mechanisms. If you remember from the Neoclassical model, that any increase in government spending extracts resources from the economy, so that leads to a negative wealth effect. And it's this negative wealth effect that sets into motion everything in a neoclassical economy. Consumption declines because households feel less wealthy. Labor supply increases since leisure is a normal good. So the way they face these resources being extracted is they decrease their consumption somewhat and they decrease their leisure somewhat. And it's that increase in labor supply is the only reason that output rises in the short run, since capital is fixed. Now, with government investment, though, there is a counteracting positive wealth effect because the increase in public capital raises future output. That means you're going to have more wealth in the future. So then you have that smaller net negative wealth effect. So you get a smaller increase in labor supply and a smaller decrease in consumption. Thus, government investment spending actually leads to more crowding out of private investment in the short run. And it's because you don't get output increasing so much because you don't have that labor supply, and they're not reducing consumption as much. So it's something that you might not expect, until you work through this model. So the baseline calibration of the neoclassical model, most of it's pretty straightforward, but let me highlight a few points. First of all, because I wanted to do things similarly to Baxter and King, who actually have a very high friction labor elasticity of labor supply, although people didn't realize it at the time. And also because I want to pivot off of a new Keynesian paper by Gali Lopez Salido and Bouakez, my parameter that governs the inverse of the friction elasticity I set to 0.25, which means the friction elasticity is 4. I will show you how things change when we reduce the friction elasticity. That also affects the Marshall elasticity, so it can have effects in the long run. The exponent on private capital, the alpha is 0.36. I'm going to start with the baseline calibration for the exponent on government capital of 0.05. And remember again that this is going to affect the degree of increasing returns to scale. So you can't ramp it up too much or you might not actually have an optimal level once you're looking at optimal government capital. The depreciation rates are calibrated to the Bureau of Economic Analysis tables on depreciation. And then I calibrate the steady state share of total government spending and investment to the US levels, about just under 18% for total government spending in the US. And this was from 2019. And spending, of course, is G, purchases, not just outlays. And then 3.5% for government investment to GDP. I'm also going to assume that there's some persistence in the process. And I'm going to assume that there's a shock to appropriations. These are government appropriations of funds for government purchases. I'm going to assume that that's 0.95 at the quarterly level. And so then the appropriations is going to follow an AR1. Now, in the government consumption or government investment, when there are no delays, which is first case I'll analyze, is just going to be set equal to appropriations. So they'll either shock government investment or I'll shock government consumption. I don't ever shock them both at the same time. All right. So what do we get in this basic model? So the green line shows you government consumption. The blue dotted line shows you a shock instead to government investment in this neoclassical baseline. This first graph here, the two lines are just laying over each other. In one case, government investment goes up. In the other case, government consumption goes up, and it goes up by 1% of GDP. So we can read multipliers straight off of these graphs for output. All right. So as I mentioned, okay, with the government consumption, we do get an increase in output, and the high friction elasticity helps this. It goes up, and then it gradually comes down, very much like government spending is doing so. Private consumption falls because of that negative wealth effect. Labor input rises, and that's the reason that output rises with government consumption. Private investment is crowded out somewhat. Now, with government investment, which is the blue line, output goes up, but not as much. And again, it's because the negative wealth effect is not as strong because of that countervailing positive wealth effect. Private consumption doesn't get crowded out as much, but private investment does get crowded out. Something's got to give, and this is a closed economy model. Obviously, you would have things going on with the current account in a small open economy model. But so private investment goes down much more. Okay. Another big difference here is, of course, with government consumption, there's just no change in public capital. Whereas if the shock is to government investment, public capital gradually increases. Okay. Here are 1-year cumulative multipliers in this model. So in the baseline calibration, where government consumption, we have AR1 appropriations, what I just showed you. The multiplier is just under 0.5 for consumption, and this is the cumulative over the first year, so it's the integral under the impulse response function. And then it's 0.4 for government investment. What happens if I lower that friction elasticity to a value that microeconomists would think is more reasonable? You can see that in both cases, the multiplier falls significantly. On the other hand, going back to the higher friction elasticity, but adding two features that are often added in new Keynesian models, but that aren't fundamentally new Keynesian. What happens if we add them here? These two features are investment adjustment cost and capital utilization. Notice that that significantly raises the multiplier. Here's the reason why. If there's investment adjustment cost, you don't get crowding out of investment because investment won't adjust very much. Capital utilization means that they can increase the utilization rate of capital so that when you have that increase in labor supply, you're not facing those diminishing returns so quickly because the capital services can rise in the short run as well. All right, so it makes the supply curve more elastic. And disregard the last column for now. All right, so pit stop on the Neoclassical before I move on to the New Keynesian.
Yes, Valerie. Yes, I have a couple of questions. I'm Andres Fernandez from the bank.
Okay.
So on the crowding out, I was expecting to see on sort of like the medium long run a different result where investment would actually, private investment would actually increase.
It does. So notice here that I've shown you only 16 quarters, 4 years, and it takes a while for the public capital to build up. And so see the private investment here does start increasing, and it's going to go above zero.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So you would have that effect. Great. And then the other is you spend very little on the theta G. Is this a level that we should regard as realistic or?
So that's the good. Both of these are great questions, and particularly since you talked about the private investment, I've forgotten to mention that. Theta G, I'm going to show you multipliers for different values of theta G. The theta G, as you'll see, is going to move. I'll do that in the context of the new Keynesian model, because you'll also see it there. It's absolutely central to the quantitative results. And so I'm going to talk about that quite a bit throughout the rest of this talk. So great question, but that particular one I'll answer better on the slides that are coming up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so new Keynesian model. So here are some of the features that I put in here. This is sort of an extension of the Gali Lopez Salido Valles 2007 paper. I've just updated a few things, which I'll highlight here. So they had investment adjustment costs on capital. I'm putting the more modern adjustment costs on investment. And as I mentioned, that severely mutes the short run crowding out effects on private investment and helps raise the multiplier. Variable utilization of capital, as I said, is going to give you more elastic output because capital services can adjust in the short run. I have sticky prices in non-competitive product markets, which is standard. But I'm going to add, as Colchiago did, because he extended the Gali et al. Paper, to also include sticky wages in non-competitive labor markets, all right? And it parallels the price setup. The reason I do this is because of a recent paper by Per Krusell and co-authors of the Ari Stud. They did it for monetary. I then sent them an email and I said, does this also apply for government spending multipliers? And they said, we'll get back to you in a week. And they wrote a new paper in response to my question, which is great. And it does. Here's what they found. In a benchmark new Keynesian model with only sticky prices and with government spending, analyzing that, new Keynesian multipliers, even that simple benchmark model without all of these additional things, will have a bigger multiplier. The only reason it does is because in the sticky price model, there are countercyclical markups, and those countercyclical markups lead to countercyclical profits. And so those countercyclical profits lead to an additional negative wealth effect on households, that when government spending goes up, households feel less wealthy, not only for the neoclassical reasons, but also because the profits have gone down. Now, when I presented this at Michigan somewhere, people said, I was talking about the NK model, new Keynesian, and somebody said, if that's the mechanism, it should be called the not Keynesian model, all right? It just has nothing to do with our intuition for what the Keynesian mechanism should be. It's for that reason that I put in the sticky wages and the non-competitive labor markets. I also follow Gali et al., where I have a mix of life cycle permanent income hypothesis and rule of thumb consumers, so we can get larger effects of temporary income on consumption. And I allow for half of the households to be rule of thumb consumers. So I'm ramping up this model so it can give you big multipliers for government consumption, because that's really going to highlight something that's going to come up when I talk about government investment when there are delays. Again, elastic labor supply, say high first elasticity, and then standard monetary policy and fiscal policy rules. I have a Taylor rule with only inflation, again, following Gali. Okay, so what do we get here? Again, the green line is a shock to government consumption. The blue dotted line is a shock to government investment. All right, in the new Keynesian baseline, there are no lags, all right? So that spending happens right away. In the new Keynesian baseline, all of those things we put in, particularly the non-competitive labor markets, shuts down all those short-run wealth effects, all right? So we're shutting down those sorts of things in the neoclassical model that might be at odds with many people's intuition. That is why we're getting very similar results on output in the short run, because all that matters is how much the government's spending and how much those rule of thumb consumers are consuming, and then how much firms then want to demand of labor, since individuals are off their labor supply curve because of these non-competitive labor markets. All right, so the short run is very similar. We get a few little differences as we get to the intermediate run here with consumption and with government consumption versus government investment, that effect on private consumption. And then we see the investment really picking up, private investment in response to the government investment. And again, that's because it's crowding in the intermediate to long run, the private investment. Public capital, again, that's going to be rising with government investment, but not with the government consumption. All right. Let's see, somehow there. Okay, good. Now, oops, I didn't want that. So here are those one-year cumulative multipliers now, where I've added the new Keynesian model. You see that when we go from just under 0.5 to above 1 for that integral multiplier for the new Keynesian model. But notice, even with all those new Keynesian bells and whistles, rule of thumb consumers, those are all in there. If I simply take out investment adjustment costs and utilization, look how low the Keynesian multiplier is. I think a lot of people don't realize how important that investment adjustment cost can be. If I lower the Frisch elasticity, it goes down, not as much as this case. If I take out rule of thumb households, I get 0.68. All right, so rule of thumb households are important, but something that's really important for that first year multiplier is the investment adjustment cost. All right, I get very similar results, actually slightly bigger for government investment here. But again, that's going to go down once I take out, add, or subtract these other features. Okay. And again, we're not going to talk about that final column until just a little bit. All right. So before I talk about delays, any questions about the new Keynesian model? And I'm going to show you longer run multipliers in a little bit, but just for these initial experiments.
Valerie? This is Ernesto from the bank. I don't know whether this question is well placed in this part of the talk. Could we conclude so far that since adjustment costs on investment are so important, is this really a call for SS models or something like that?
That's a possibility. So Sarah Zuberi and I've had a paper in progress for several years. We keep getting busy with other things, but looking at this investment adjustment cost, we actually found, when we looked at the literature, we actually found good micro studies that support an investment adjustment cost, because I was very skeptical at first. However, what we were focusing on, and let me be clear, I'm doing the standard thing here of assuming an AR1 process for government consumption investment. If you make that process more complicated, you can get all kinds of changes going on. In particular, my favorite process is usually one of these ones with a hump in it, because that's what happens with military spending. Once you have that, you get a news effect, and the investment adjustment costs in some of those cases don't matter so much, because you're getting a news about things happening. So there are all kinds of interesting dynamics going on, and we just haven't had a chance. We've run a lot of experiments. It's trying to put them in a coherent way that we just haven't had a chance to do. But that's a very good question. So this particular thing is for this baseline. And the reason I chose it is because, I was doing so many other new things. I didn't want to change this one, because Leeper et al. Used the AR1, and so did many others. But it's something to keep in mind. If you don't think that government spending is an AR1, then a lot of these results will differ.
Additionally, some other stuff that may also be interesting is that in reality, firms tend to, firms sell to the government many of the investment goods or that the government is building. So at the end, that's going to feed back into the firms themselves somehow, especially if this channel is going to be so important.
Yes, and you should particularly read Christoph Baum's JME paper is exactly on that. He has a two-sector model, and if the government investment is going into the investment sector, then you get all kinds of interesting results coming from that. So absolutely right. And I talk about his work in more detail in the paper. I don't have quite as much time now. I'll talk about it just a little bit, but not as much as I'd like to. All right, the effects of implementation delays. So a very nice paper by Leeper, Walker, and Yang in 2010 in the JME argue that infrastructure investment has an important time to build feature. After appropriations are made, actual spending happens gradually. Public capital is often not productive until fully completed. Nobody's riding that bullet train in California, even though part of it's been built, because it's not connected to anything. On average, the lags are 1 year for simple road maintenance, but can be 4 years for new roads and highways. And of course, for bigger infrastructure projects, it can be even more. Now, they just call this time to build, but I think that there are really two aspects of this. And so I call it time to spend versus time to build, because they actually have different effects. I don't analyze the different effects in this paper, but if anybody were to generalize this, I think this would be a useful exercise. So time to spend here is the idea that, remember those appropriations that we had the shock to, and I assume that government spending was instantly increased by them? Here, I'm going to assume that there's a shock to appropriations, then the amount of government spending is going to be evenly distributed across a certain number of quarters from that appropriation. I'm going to just use 6 quarters, so you can see that I'm assuming shorter lags than for new roads, but slightly longer lags than for road maintenance. And then the time to build feature simply says that it's not until you only get the increase in capital end periods after that appropriation. And again, I'm going to assume this is 6 quarters. Those wouldn't have to be the same, but just for simplicity, I do that. Okay, and just some evidence on implementation delays. Remember, they were looking for shovel-ready projects in the US for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This is the Obama stimulus. And yet, a year after, they had spent less than 60%. 2 years after, they were spending a little over 8. They'd spent a little bit over 80%, and then finally got to normal. Now, the delay wasn't so bad for the Great Recession in the US, because unemployment stayed high for a long time. So when the stimulus was coming, they still needed it. However, in a more normal recession, the recession will be over and the expansion will be going by the time much of the spending comes online. So what happens if we put time to build and time to spend delays? All right. So all of this is for government investment now. I don't have the consumption part in here. The blue line is when there are no delays, and it's a shock to government investment. So public capital builds up here. The purple line is time to spend and time to build. Okay. And this is in the new Keynesian model. So remember, we put all these wonderful things in the new Keynesian model to get that big short-run stimulus. These things completely undo it. All right. So government spending there's the delay, and then it slowly builds up and then comes back down, the actual spending. What that means is actually in the short run, output actually goes down slightly and then slowly comes up, by Q6 and then starts coming down. Private consumption goes down and actually stays down most of the time. Private investment, whereas before with that government investment thing, where it was slowly going up, here it is falling. Labor input, again, falls, right? Why increase your labor? Because firms aren't demanding it, because there's no spending going on in the short run. Eventually, public capital increases with both, but of course there's a lag in the increase when you have these time to spend and time to build delays, all right? So the bottom line from here is, even with all those new Keynesian bells and whistles from this medium scale new Keynesian model, if you have time to spend and time to build, and particularly that time to spend, it just wipes out all of that new Keynesian stimulus. 1 year cumulative multipliers. So this is the same table I told you about before, but I said, don't look at this last one. It has a slight effect on reducing multipliers in the neoclassical model, not so much. But here's where you get the big difference, all right? So we had a multiplier over the first year of 1.1 for government investment with no lags. Once you put the lags in, the multiplier is 0.08. And then in some of these other experiments, you actually get a slightly negative multiplier. Here it is over 5 years, so 20 quarters, all right? The black line is government consumption. The blue line is government investment with the theta G 0.05. The orange line is government investment with a higher exponent, 0.1, okay? So here's where we're now going to start talking about the importance of this theta G. So let's think first about the no delays neoclassical model, all right?
Valerie?
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting again, Ernesto.
Okay. Yeah.
Could you go back one, please? Sure. One slide.
Yeah.
How important is here the reaction of monetary policy to determine these differences in multipliers? So an exercise that I could imagine is to, let's assume that monetary policy reacts exactly in the same way as in the first column, but then add the ingredients of the last column, see how the multiplier can be, and then add the differential effect of monetary policy in the world of the first column relative to the third column.
That's a great idea. I did not do that, but here's the case: is I put all my programs online so that and they're dynamic, so anybody can go and do that experiment. I think that's a great idea for experiment. I'm going to talk about the zero lower bound in a little while, but I really like your experiment of trying to figure out how much is from monetary policy. That's a really good idea. I don't know if there are any graduate students. Is this all Banco de Chile, or are there grad students in the audience?
It's a broader invitation, so mostly it's people from the bank, but
yeah,
there could be some spice, yes.
Whatever, there are grad students in the audience, so I said that's a good idea for a dissertation chapter. So, no, that would be a very interesting thing to look at. All right, so let's talk about the symbol case, the neoclassical model, and let's just do the comparison here with the two values of theta G. So as theta G goes up, that short run multiplier goes down, and it's because a higher theta G is reducing the negative wealth effect. So labor supply doesn't go up as much, all right? But of course, the long run multiplier goes up because now you're starting to get the, the productivity effects of that increase in public capital. Now, let me say, when I get to the lags with time to spend and time to build, okay, it didn't matter here. Here, when I constructed the multipliers, I took the integral of the output response and divided it by the integral of the government spending response, which was identical to the appropriations because there was no lags in spending, all right? Once we have lags in spending, I can't really divide things by the integral of the government spending response because it's 0 for the, initially. So these multipliers are dividing by the appropriations. So the denominator in here is the same as the denominator in there. It's appropriations, but it's not the actual spending, because otherwise it'll look like you have an infinite multiplier, because output responds right away, but government spending doesn't. And that's always been an issue with all of my news shocks. That's why my multipliers look so strange at the beginning, right? But in this case, I'm just doing it with appropriations. Okay, with time, let's go now to the new Keynesian model. We get similar results here. In the new Keynesian model, remember, with no delays, government investment actually has slightly higher multipliers than government consumption. And if government investment has a higher exponent, then it gets even higher. But as soon as we put time to spend and time to build delays, all of those new Keynesian effects go away, and we get slightly negative to 0 multipliers in the short run, and then they start increasing, but it takes a while. They will cross here later, but it really has a big effect on the multipliers. So here are some long-run multipliers from these simulated models. The first gives you the present discounted value of the integral using the interest rate generated by the model. The second gives you the undiscounted integral, just so you can tell, it's nice to see both of them. The initial steady state is about what the US is at government investment to GDP ratio of 3.5%. And here's no delays. Here's for 2 values of the theta G, 0.05 and 0.1. And then in this case, we're going to have a 6-quarter time to build delay. Here's the neoclassical model. Here's the new Keynesian model, neoclassical, new Keynesian, PDV, and undiscounted. All right. So the delays aren't so important for the long run. I mean, they do decrease it somewhat. If you look at the undiscounted multiplier, say right here versus right here, the adding delays just doesn't have much of an effect. It has a little bit here in the new Keynesian model. Let's see. A couple things to take away from this. Both in the neoclassical model and the new Keynesian model, the long-run multiplier rises if the theta G is higher, which is just what we would expect, okay? It's also the case with the new Keynesian model. It goes up even more because, again, we had those initial stimulus when there were no delays. When we put delays on, it does reduce the new Keynesian model somewhat, but not as much for this long-run multiplier, all right? So the delays are not so important for the long run. They were important for the short-run stimulus, okay? Let me just talk briefly about the importance of the starting point. The size of the multiplier depends on whether the increase in government investment takes the economy towards or away from the socially optimal public capital stock. And one can actually use the neoclassical model, solve it where you allow the social planner to pick this, and it implies the social optimum. You can see theta G is absolutely key. And other things that matter is the discount factor and the depreciation rate. And if we think that the theta G is 0.05, then government investment should be 2.5% of GDP for this baseline calibration. If theta G is 0.1, then government investment should be 5, right? In fact, you can see here it's just directly proportional, right? So it really matters what theta G is, okay? Because I'm running a little low on time, let me just overview this. Long-run multipliers for different starting points. If you're an economy starting way below the social optimum and there's an increase in government investment, you will have a bigger long-run multiplier than if you were already at the social optimum and then you increase government investment anymore. So that's pretty intuitive, so I don't need to spend so much time on that, but you can see the graphs in the paper, all right? Just a quick overview of generalizations that significantly affect the model results. So Lieber et al. Used distortionary taxation, and that's why they have much smaller multipliers, despite our other calibrations being very similar. And we all know that distortionary taxation can have a negative effect. Now, the way to really think about this, particularly if one's thinking about transportation infrastructure, the way the government in the US built its interstate highway system was by putting on a gas tax, which essentially created a user fee to finance the government investment, which I think is, a much better way of doing it rather than just putting distortionary taxation on any kind of income. But one can also analyze that kind of thing. Accommodative monetary policy in the ZLB can raise short-run multipliers. We know that from a number of papers, but particularly, turns out these time to build delays can actually raise multipliers, right? And this is related to Eggertson's expansionary effects of negative supply shocks. And this was highlighted beautifully in these papers in red and JME by Bouakez, Gouillard, and Rouleau-Pastelou. What they show is, so remember from Eggertson, if you're at the zero lower bound, a negative supply shock can be expansionary because it creates inflation, which lowers the real interest rate. Okay. Bouakez et al. Show you get that same effect if you put time to build delays on government investment. All right. Now, I am very skeptical of this mechanism for a variety of reasons. One is my colleagues, Johannes Wieland's JPE paper showing that despite Japan being at the zero lower bound, the tsunami and earthquake was not expansionary for them. And there are a number of other papers that make me think that this isn't really working. It's a really interesting theoretical result. I'm just not sure that that's the mechanism in practice. And I talk a little bit more about this in the paper. All right, so we figured out that theta G is really important. All right. So what is theta G? And I'm on the panel of economic advisors for the Congressional Budget Office, so they ask me this a lot. All right. So there are three main approaches to estimating it. One is the time series aggregate data. Another is country panels or cross sections, and a third is panels of industries, states. I shouldn't have industries there again. And there are a number of really good papers doing this. Identification is very challenging. All right. First of all, there's a distinction between the production function elasticity versus general equilibrium output elasticities that I'll talk about. But then there's the issue of endogenous public capital. All right. So how does one estimate these production function elasticities? Well, the research back in the late 80s, early 90s by Aschauer and Manel basically estimated production function by estimating the parameters of this equation. They just took log of output equals log of the TFP plus alpha log of capital 1 minus alpha log of labor, and then put the stock of public capital there. When they estimated this, they found theta G equal to 0.39. Manel found 0.31 to 0.39. And that's what led Aschauer to argue that the productivity slowdown in the early 70s in the US was because the US had started investing much less in infrastructure and it was depreciating. Okay. Now, Baum and Lick, now that was very controversial because that's a very high number. And there are all kinds of issues, as I will point out with this. Baum and Lithgard have a very nice meta-analysis of looking at many, many studies over the years. And it settles on a value of theta G of about 0.08 in the short run and about 0.12 in the long run.
Valerie, just one curiosity. In this production function estimation, they are doing just an OLS, or they are considering the fact that the inputs are endogenous to productivity?
Their basic thing was an OLS, but they knew there were issues with endogeneity. And so then what they did, which was the thing people did in the late 80s, I did some of this too, is they used lagged endogenous variables as instruments. We now know that that's a bad idea, but that's what they did. Okay, and I'll talk about a few other ways that people tried to do things as well. Now, Alfredo Pereira, who was my colleague at the time, and Flores de Frutos estimated long-run elasticities from SVARs. Okay, so this was estimating the general equilibrium output elasticities. Now notice, because of VAR allows all variables to respond, Pereira and Flores de Frutos' elasticity includes the endogenous response of private investment to anything else that might change, okay? Thus, what they were doing here with the VAR was estimating the steady state general equilibrium output elasticity of public capital, because they look at these long run elasticities. I'm going to call that epsilon SS YKG. They estimate this elasticity as 0.63, all right? But I'm saying that that's the steady state general equilibrium elasticity, whereas what Manel and Aschauer were estimating was the production function elasticity, that theta G of 0.39. Now, that simple neoclassical model actually gives us a link between the production function elasticity and the general equilibrium steady state output elasticity. So I just worked through this, and I found that the steady state output general equilibrium elasticity is related to the production function elasticity with this equation, where this omega is this thing, where this term is the Hicks elasticity of labor supply. Delta G is just the depreciation rate on public capital, and KG over C is the ratio of public capital to consumption, right? So it's equal to this relationship. And so it just depends on what your calibration is. You can get a link between those two. Now, using that baseline calibration that I did for the neoclassical model, and let me say, I used that calibration because I was sort of following Leaper and stuff. It was not to set up the surprising result you'll get here. When I use that calibration, it implies that the steady state general equilibrium elasticity is equal to this affine function of the production function elasticity. Now recall that Aschauer estimated this production function elasticity of 0.39. If I plug that into that equation, it implies a steady state general equilibrium elasticity of 0.63, which is exactly what Pereira and Flores de Frutos found in their VAR. So it's astounding that they line up perfectly according to this simple calibration of a baseline neoclassical model. In any case, this simple model is really helpful for sorting out the various elasticity estimates from the literature. Now, let's talk about the really hard problem, which is the econometric problem of endogenous capital, all right? Endogeneity can occur for numerous reasons, but the one I'll focus on here is it happens in part because wealthier economies invest in more public capital, all right? A benevolent social planner will respond to technological progress, the A, remember the TFP, by increasing the amount of public capital, because technological progress raises the marginal product of public capital. Now, the earlier literature tried to deal with endogeneity. As I mentioned, they used lagged endogenous variables, Cholesky decompositions, and other techniques that are not ideal. So to illustrate this, I'm going to use something that I've called a DSGE Monte Carlo. Something many people have used these, but I just named it in my handbook chapter because I thought it was a useful thing to have a name for it. What I do is I generalize the calibrated neoclassical model that I had to allow the social planner to choose the optimal level of public capital. I use my baseline calibration where theta G is 0.05, and I allow technology A to vary. All right, that's stochastically. Right? And as we know, an increase in A is going to raise the marginal product of public capital and raise the optimal public capital level. I'm going to focus on how the steady state general equilibrium values of key variables change. Okay, now, then I'm going to take that artificial data from my model and run some, I'm going to run some regressions on it. Okay, so the theoretical model implies that the standard measures of TFP that we would get, say, from John Fernald's measure for the US are related to true technology and public capital as follows. Log of TFP is going to be log of the true technology, but also because John Fernald doesn't include infrastructure in here, it's going to also include theta G times log of public capital. So suppose we regress log of TFP on log of public capital, all right? Now note that this true technology A is in that error term, okay? That's what's going to create the problem because the social planner is going to adjust public capital based on what's going on in that error term. So we have correlation there. So now I'm going to construct log TFP from the artificial data as log output minus the share weighted logs of private capital and labor. And I'm going to regress it on the log of public capital. in the simulated data, I actually get an estimate of theta G, huge, 0.64. All right, so much higher than even ash hours. And remember, this is still keeping private capital constant, so it's just huge. And we know that the true value is 0.05. All right, so in this simple model, it just illustrates how this endogenous social planner response to true technology results in significant upward bias in the estimated theta G. So how do we deal with the bias? It is very, very hard to get an instrument, okay? But let's consider what Bouakez et al. Did, where they estimated some actual data. So most of their paper was about their quantitative new Keynesian model and about the zero lower bound. But some referee, I think, made them do some empirics, but they're really intriguing, even though it's a very short part. They present some independent evidence using US aggregate data. They don't discuss endogeneity at all, but they say it is still important to account for the additional factors that may affect TFP in the long run. So they use Fernald's measure of TFP, but they also construct measures of the stock of R&D spending and the stock of human capital. It turns out they find co-integration if they include those two other things in there, which Pereira and Flores de Frutos couldn't find co-integration because they hadn't put these extra measures there. So this suggests that Bouakez et al. Have captured the stochastic trends in TFP. So by including these additional sources of TFP as control variables, they are likely reducing the upward bias of the regression of log TFP on log public capital. They estimate that theta G equals 0.065 from their co-integrating regression, all right? So much lower than the 0.39 that you might get. But I said, oh, well, they have updated data relative to Ashauer and Manel. What happens if we don't control for R&D and human capital, which they didn't show? So fortunately, you know, most journals make you post your data in replication files. So I downloaded their data, re-estimated the equation as they had it, got the same result. But then I say, what if I estimate the regression without R&D and human capital? I estimate that theta G equals 0.33, all right? So which is much closer to Ashauer Manel, showing you what happens when you allow too much of that technology to be in the error term. You get this upward bias, all right? So this is from the actual data, and it's consistent, at least qualitatively, with what I showed you from the DSGE Monte Carlo. Now, the comparison of those estimates, as I say, shows the importance of endogeneity. And those controls do seem to go far to diminish the upward bias due to the social planner response. But after thinking about it for a while, I thought, uh-oh, their estimate may be downward biased, though, since government investment is likely a key driver of both R&D and human capital. All right, if you think of government investment more broadly conceived than the usual national accounting. Public capital affects A in the stylized model, so it is not appropriate to simply include these two variables as controls because they're also endogenous, right? So I think that their estimate is probably downward bias. In any case, I think they have made progress on the problem. We haven't gotten the definitive estimate, but we've made progress. And estimating the theta G is just very difficult. You can look across states and all those sorts of things. So one of my students, Danielle Lefiafi, did a beautiful dissertation on the effect of the interstate highway program using all kinds of modern methods, but he did it across states for a panel of states, and to take it to find an aggregate multiplier because of the spillovers, the network effects, he had to use a trade model to do it, right? You can't just take those estimates, and that's why it's so much harder. So you get better identification at the sub-national level, but then turning it into a macro estimate is much harder. All right. So let me briefly, so let me pause there since that's a, you know, we're jumping to something else. Any questions on this? Okay. And I have to like 10:15 before we stop for discussion, right? Or 10:15 my time, which is 7:15 after whatever it is your time. Okay, let me just briefly overview the short run effects, and then I'm going to skip over them and go to the last part. This is what I usually do in the 1-hour seminar, so it's fine. I'm good at skipping over this part. So my survey of the literature that I talk about in the paper reveals scant empirical evidence that infrastructure spending has short-run stimulus effects. You just don't see it. In fact, there are more papers that find negative effects on employment than positive effects in the short run. The Obama stimulus results are particularly negative, despite occurring during a period during which the economy was at the zero lower bound and the unemployment rate was 9 to 10%. So even with all that slack in the economy, with the zero lower bound, you often get negative employment effects. The time to spend and time to build may explain those effects. Remember those little negatives that look so weird in the graphs? There is empirical support for those negative values. I don't know if that's the mechanism, but it's out there in the data. All right, so I'm going to skip over that part. Now, let's talk about, Optimum. Sorry. Okay, so, a key question is whether the US or any government is underinvesting or overinvesting in public capital. So here is US government capital as a percent of GDP from the late 1920s through 2019, okay? So blue is total, but I'm also showing you non-defense, even though the US thinks defense spending has productive value, I think at least, but it doesn't show up in the production function and directly affect the private investment. So I think that this is the more relevant one. And then transportation is here in red. Now, something that's interesting is we did have this big decline in the amount of government capital, even in the non-defense sector, but there was actually an increase around the time of the Great Recession. So some of that buildup actually brought us up to a higher level. Now, let's do a comparison of the actual versus model optimum public capital and investment. So let's focus here on, so this is actual data for 2018 for the US. Let's focus on excluding defense. Government capital as a percent of GDP was 64%, and government investment as a percent of GDP was 2.6%, okay? Now, for the neoclassical model social optimum, so we're thinking the long run here, that's why we're looking at the neoclassical model. If theta G is 0.05, then we would actually want a slightly lower, we're right at the optimum, yes, basically, 2.6, 2.5, not a big difference. If theta G is 0.065, then we would want a bigger share of government investment or government capital as a percent of GDP. It should be 3.2. If we think that theta G is what Baum and Lithgard's meta-analysis said was 0.12, now remember that was over many decades typically in different countries. So that's backward looking, and there's a question of whether the marginal product would be as high now. But if we think that theta G is 0.12, then we really want a much higher government investment share of GDP in steady state and a much higher government capital percent of GDP. So I can't give you an answer definitive about whether we are above or below or right at the optimum because this is just a stylized neoclassical model, but I think it's a good starting point for getting the conversation started, and then one can add additional complications such as geographic distribution of infrastructure. And one of the examples I have is that because Detroit is losing population, it might have too much infrastructure, whereas Seattle, where it's gaining population and there's a lot of congestion, probably has too little infrastructure. So it would be interesting to look at this in a more complicated model. One of the papers I talk about is a nice paper by Gallen and Winston, who use a DSGE model, but and they focus on transportation capital, and they have all kinds of interesting generalizations. So one example is, so they look at welfare effects, and one of the effects is that it saves people time in commuting to work or commuting to shopping. So they capture that in their model, which is not at all captured here. So if you have better roads and less congestion, people save time. But then they also have short-run negative effects of building infrastructure because they model something that they've noted very much in practice, which is when you are building new roads and new infrastructure, it tends to be very disruptive so that you can actually decrease productivity in the short run because roads are all torn up and people can't get from one place to the other very easily. So just, I didn't need, well, I think we could, I can always go back and do that part that you wanted, but let me go ahead and, see what time is it? Yeah, I am, you know what, let me go back and talk about the other. I was able to get through this much quicker than I thought. So let me talk about these short run effects during the ARA, all right? So one of the things I do is focus on this nice paper by Leduc and Wilson in AJ Macro, where they use cross-state variation in ARRA appropriations for highways to study what they call flypaper effects. Flypaper effects are, to what extent does federal aid, central government aid, lead to more spending by state and local governments? Now they find significant crowd in, which is that each $1 of federal aid resulted in a total of $2.30 in state highway spending. Now, they don't analyze the impact on employment and highway construction. They're more interested in how the state and local spending responds to the federal. But they actually have the data and they show some spending results in the appendix. So once again, I was able to download their programs and data and send them emails with clarification questions and run new results with their data. And I use their instruments to investigate the employment effects. Now, a very nice paper by Andrew Guerin in the Journal of Urban Economics makes the point that to have a positive effect of highway spending on highway construction employment is necessary for any further effects, such as local spillovers and Keynesian multipliers, all right? If you don't get that initial impetus to construction employment, nothing else is going to happen. So, revisiting their analysis, I'm using local projections here like they did. The first three graphs here are very similar to what they have. It basically just reproduces what they have. There was obligations for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and then those, they were huge, and then they went away. So this is kind of like the appropriations, also it's just a one-off. Then the outlays, you can see that there is a delay here where the federal government is giving these transfers. But then when you look at total highway spending as it goes through state and local, you can see that that is much more spread out over time, all right? Now here, so then I run, the new result is what happened to highway construction employment, right? So we do get a small we get a positive effect, it's statistically significant, but then you get the very strange effect, I've seen this on a number of papers, where it goes negative. And in fact, in Leduc and Wilson's 2013 paper in the NBR Macro Annual that used a panel of states looking back to the early 90s, they found the same effect in the intermediate run, which they didn't highlight, but I highlighted a lot in my discussion. It's very, very puzzling. Now, to make it even more puzzling is the importance of controls. So Bill Dupour argues to the contrary, that the federal grants crowded out state and local spending. Now, he just notes in passing, he gets different results from Leduc and Wilson, and he includes the log of state population as a control in his local projections, which they don't do. Now, neither author says why you should include or exclude log of population. I haven't had time to think about it, but I said, let's see what happens if I take Leduc and Wilson's data, framework, instruments, and just add the log of population as a control. Well, what happens there? This is still very similar to what they have. But now I'm not seeing the highway spending go up, all right? I am seeing results like Bill Dupour found, which at least helps a little bit with kind of understanding why highway employment doesn't go up. It doesn't help you understand very much why it goes down. It makes you worry that these instruments aren't great because there might have been pre-trends leading to issues. But anyway, so my bottom line on these kinds of results is they are very sensitive to specification. I don't even know what the actual results are. So I think, you know, much more work could be done on that. All right, so to summarize and conclude, you know, the whole talk, the basic thing to take from this is that even when government investment has significant positive long-run effects, the short-run stimulus multipliers are less than those from government spending in most cases, and it's because just the inherent lags and delays that accompany government infrastructure investment, all right? And the, you know, additional crowding out of the private spending that you get from that. Now, long-run multipliers in government investment depend critically on both the production functional elasticity and on where the economy begins relative to the socially optimal level of public capital. And then, as you saw, estimating the production functional elasticity is challenging. Previous estimates of 0.39 are likely severely upward biased. On the other hand, the very nice estimate by Bouakez et al. Of 0.065 might be a lower bound. So, you know, that puts us, maybe we're in the range of that meta-analysis that says 0.08 to 0.12. That's probably my favorite estimates at this point, but I don't have strong priors. And if somebody does a great empirical job and sends me another estimate, I'll believe those over these. All right.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for this great presentation. Please, if you have a question or a comment, just jump in.
I have a couple of comments. Andres again. But before, thank you so much, Valerie. Very insightful. So let me mention the first one, and if I have time and there are no other questions, I'll mention the second one. So, so it's about the time to spend and delays element, right? So it's clear from your presentation that if one takes this seriously, this is gonna reduce the impact of this type of investment considerably, right? I take this as the main takeaway.
It's going to reduce the impact in the short run. It doesn't have much effect for the long run impact.
For the long run, yes, got it. But what I missed from the talk, and maybe it's surely because I didn't get it, is what is the evidence of these delays and time to spend? So you did present some or mention, but one of the things that I'm wondering is, are these models the ones that push for this time to spend and delays? Are they disciplining these elements formally with the data? Is this what you do when you estimate these omegas in the appropriation process?
No, I just picked them out of the air just for style, but Leeper et al. Do various ones, and then they talk about exactly what was going on during the ARRA. So that's the 2010 paper in the JME. They estimate their model, but I don't think they estimate the extent of the time to build delays. But one could do that.
I guess what I'm wondering is, it would be much more potent, the argumentation, if one were to show before the effects of this time to spend and delays, that this model properly match the time series properties of public investment, public consumption, etc. Right? So
yes, you could do it. I mean, I certainly know about details. I mean, my whole QJE paper was about this, and I know about it from reading Business Week, you know, going back to 1939 and even earlier and later work, that, for example, even with things that aren't government investment, although I guess some of this would be considered. So I can talk about defense spending, so tanks and airplanes, which I guess is considered government investment. When North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, basically the Cold War started then, but it took forever to get the spending out. And the reason is that, first of all, the Pentagon had to come up with its overall strategy of how it was going to fight this war in Korea, and then how it was going to deal with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And senators such as Johnson, who later became president, was just really mad. And, you know, in Business Week, they were talking about this over and over again. Then once they came up with their strategy, then they had to figure out what exact kind of equipment they needed, what kind of planes were the best to have, what kind of that. So then they had, I mean, you know, from Big G, right, Ernesto, right? Then they had to do these prime contracts. They had to put them out for bidding. They had to figure out which company is the best one, which company has the best product, which company, da, 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 da. So then they finally do that. And then they start hiring workers and building these things, all right? So this happens, you know, presumably you would think it wouldn't be so complicated in infrastructure spending. When I gave this at the conference, and I was like one of the few macroeconomists there, Eduardo Engel was also there. He was talking about public-private partnerships. We were there, and I thought, oh boy, because I'm going to sound negative about infrastructure spending in the short run. The transportation people got up and cheered practically because they said, oh, the lags are so long, and the environmental impact reports and stuff. And then suddenly I remembered, because we're trying to save the canyon by my house from putting a road through. And we said, no, environmental impact report. No, you haven't done it the right way. And they still haven't built that road. They will never build that road. And it's so, and then trying to, you know, put some, you know, the bullet train in California. Nobody on the peninsula in Silicon Valley wants that thing anywhere near them, right? So that's why it's going in the Central Valley where, you know, hardly any, well, a bunch of farmers live, right? So all of this back and forth and negotiation delays, even if the government says, we'll give you this money, actually being able to spend it takes a long, long time.
Okay.
So there's good micro, so let me just say, the micro foundations are so good, and my narrative evidence was enough that this is one case where I just didn't feel like I needed to, you know, estimate it off some aggregate time series. But one could do it. I think it's a nice idea, but I felt comfortable enough about these delays that I didn't. Sorry about that.
More questions? Okay, so in the meantime, I'm going to ask something myself. Something I bet you also get a lot asked in Congress is how the lessons that you take in this paper on your own agenda can help us to optimize the, let's say, a stimulus package or government infrastructure package. So on this particular paper, how shall we design the package in order to get the maximum short run or long run effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a big thing that I didn't even talk about, in part because I was doing the macro thing, is in my all my model, government investment spending is what we call schmoo. It's all just one amorphous kind of thing. And the Congressional Budget Office, so there are a bunch of economists there that is nonpartisan, and then they're the ones who talk to the congressmen. Fortunately, so I only have to talk to the Congressional Budget Office, which is good. But they asked me, how do we think about what that theta G is on different types of infrastructure spending? And it is hard. And one of the things I told them, I said that, you know, there was a nice paper in the early 90s by Paul Evans, who had actually taught me at Stanford years ago, and Karras, K-A-R-R-A-S, and Ari Stat, that used a panel of states and had nice measures of different types of infrastructure investment and estimated things. And I said it would be great. In fact, I told this to our grad students when I was presenting this, if somebody went back to that, updated the data, and then used more modern methods and tried to estimate those theta Gs for the different types of infrastructure. And it's, you know, to be clear, it's really hard because I think that the theta G was really high on the US Interstate Highway Program, but that doesn't mean it would be high if we built a second one, right? That the elasticity, because the marginal product goes down. I mean, the theta G could be there, but basically if you're going to get diminishing returns. And so going forward, you know, what kind of infrastructure makes sense? This is where you just have to use your gut so green infrastructure, to the extent that that can kind of rev up the private sector by, say doing some charging stations for electrical vehicles that will then help stimulate the market for electrical vehicles, which then gets the private sector to do charging stations, is probably a good idea. So this sort of jump start sort of thing. Internet infrastructure, maybe improving that, particularly from an inequality perspective. Certainly, when one looks at roads, they could use some help. But if we're changing to a new economy, with electric vehicles and all those things, it shouldn't be just doing more of what we did before. And in that sense, we can't just use time series data from the past to get really clear insight into the most productive things for the future.
Yeah, but concentrating on this paper, for instance, there are several margins that I think governments can play with. So for instance, one natural one is go and invest on those sectors where the gap between the actual capital stock and the, let's say, the socially desired capital stock is the largest. That's the obvious one, and probably hard to measure. But some others, so for instance, this time to spend, or go to sectors where the time to build is the shortest, or stuff like that.
Not necessarily. So one point I forgot to make here is one of the way to summarize the results in terms of policy is that now is a great time for the U.S. to invest in infrastructure spending, because it doesn't need short-run stimulus, because the economy is recovering very well. So you don't want to adopt an infrastructure spending program in a recession. You want to do it in an expansion, which is contrary to what I was telling reporters in 2009. We all thought, oh, if there's slack in the economy, this is a good thing. But we hadn't realized how even shovel-ready projects take a while to build. So in that case, adopt infrastructure spending for the long-run effects. Don't do it for the short-run effects.